Good evening. I'm going to talk about something tonight that really bothers me. It is about financial interests, which actually turn down many areas of life that I know of, like publishing in science, getting granted in science, having access to education, how things are going on in academia, and also how we have access to health, which is all connected. So let me start with publishing. If you're working in academia, let's say as researcher or a lecturer, and depending on your role, you can deal with work with students, lecturing them, preparing lectures, preparing tests, grading them, advising them on their work, like what they choose for, let's say, master studies or PhD studies, help them develop methodology for that, help them find resources, etc., etc. Then you have your research. Then you have a lot of bureaucratic obligations, like filling in the documents, communicating with secretariat or something like that, and publishing what you do, because publishing is essential for academia. For example, every researcher and lecturer is basically judged based on how much publication does she have. So publisher perish is very real. And when you realize that of all the time dedicated to academia, you have actually 10 or 15% time to do the research, which should be essential, then it basically leads to overworking many people who are working in science. So you have to work your evening hours, you have to work on weekends. I mean, you don't have to, but the goal is to publish your research. And then the next problem is, where do you do your research? If you're in so-called developed countries, it is organized in a certain way. For example, you're usually paid for by the project, which is acquired by your university of some funding agency. It can be a state, it can be a private agency. There are a lot of European grants, etc., etc. And then it is expected from you to already start writing next grant. So there is another percentage of your time that you have to dedicate of planning future research, and basically it stops you having time for the research you should be doing now. So the thing about publishing is really weird now. I happened to work a long time ago, in the beginning of my career, for several companies who are actually selling commercial databases online, like Chadwick Healy, UMI, ProQuest, and I know how essential is access to the literature. So in that time, I was actually helping my fellow researchers to get the literature, and since we were living in a poor country that is going through economic crisis, the salaries were very low, institutions didn't have money to pay for that, and then I realized how expensive is that and how big business is it. So for example, if you want to pay for, let's say, reading a certain specialistic journal in medicine or in engineering or chemistry, whatever, this is pretty high price you have to pay. Or you can access per reading or having access to full text of certain manuscript that is published. So the thing is that, for example, you're working on your major thesis or your PhD thesis. The essential thing is to read literature first, and it is sometimes dozens of published articles, or maybe hundreds in some cases. And if you're going to pay for that, every single article, it is usually something like $40 or something like that, maybe higher or lower depending on the journal. So it translates to if you're about to pay individually, you have to pay a lot of money for that. So in so-called developed countries, actually countries who are richer, it is devised in a way that libraries are paying for that. So if you're a student or you're a researcher in university, you actually have access to reading full text of articles that you need. But if you're an individual in the country which doesn't have resources, you have to pay from your own pocket. So people are solving that in very inventive ways. For example, asking directly a colleague who published something. People are usually sharing their copies, which are not the last version or something like that, or helping you solving that. I saw that a lot. And another source is Chub, which is very, how should I say, controversial way of getting papers, but the author, who is from Russia, actually is removing the border between you as a researcher and full text. So there is ongoing trial, there is a lot of claims from publishers that it is their intellectual right, but if you dig deeper in it, what those publishers are actually doing. If you're doing research or if you're acting as a reviewer, they're not paying your work. For example, I'm acting as a reviewer in several articles because this is my field and those are my colleagues. I like to contribute in certain amount of my time, which is not paid, to critically comment on their work, and suggest them what they should improve, etc. But again, it exploded so much that publishers are using your time, and many of us are bombarded with actually invitations to review something, but this is simply too much because they're not paying us as reviewers, they're not paying researchers who did the work because universities are paying for them, meaning that all of us who are paying taxes are paying for that, and then they're selling the product of our work to third parties, to our students, to our colleagues who want to read it. So they're basically using, we are paying twice for something that we already financed. So who is villain here? The second thing which I really cannot understand why financial interest has most interest in is access to the education. This is extreme in US, not in Europe that much. But again, based on your curriculum, based on your background, where you were born, what your profile is, you realize that you don't have access to the best education, meaning that I don't have to tell you that, depending on what college you get, this is what defines access that you will have in future. But there is also antidote to that as well, which we can see in last years, and especially this pandemic emphasized that very well. This is online learning. So I believe that there is nothing to be learned that this is not already online. So many people relied on that, especially in this crisis. But my question is, at one point people will really realize that they're going the same quality of teaching and mentoring and lecturing as they're paying for on universities. So what is going to happen with universities? There are a lot of questions we should ask, and I'm simply thinking aloud in front of you what is going on with the whole educational process, with publishing process, and with science.